Good afternoon, universe. I am super excited to be here in person to see you all. So what I want to talk to you about today is the next evolution of open source software. We've had a really awesome 20 years, and I think it's time to evolve the model a little further to make sure that some of that money and profit that's coming into companies and users of open source, that it flows back to the creators and developers of open source. So I've been in open source software for about 20 years. I'm curious how many of you all have been in the open source software world, so say like 5 years. How many people have been in? Awesome. And how many people have been doing this for 10 years? Woo! And 15? Yay! Glad to have you here. Now I'm going to ask, who's pretty new to this? Like, who's just getting started or been doing it for less than a year, is here to learn? Put your hands up really high. All right, I want everybody to look around to the people that have their hands up, because I'm going to ask you to do something at the end. All right. So my first introduction to open source software was a conference. It was called GWADC. It's the annual GNOME conference. And it was planned and run by volunteers, still is planned and run by volunteers. And it was in Copenhagen. And when I came in, there was like a folding table, with like a folding chair, and there's a woman sitting behind it, like taking people's names as they came in. And she looked at me and she said, "You're a girl!" And she was just so excited there was another woman there. So I especially appreciate the diversity that we have in open source these days. That was a wonderful welcome, and I hope that those of you that are new to open source get the same kind of welcome. So 20 years ago, we were all working on projects because we were really passionate about what we were building. So like the GNOME project, everyone wanted to create a free and open source software desktop so that they could control their laptop and do what they wanted with it. And it was a challenge. Like, we had to create drivers to be able to print. So that was our goal. Others, like myself, were also really passionate about the model. Like, I really love that we are collaboratively working together, building bigger and better things, and not reinventing the wheel. So we were all doing this because we were passionate about it, but we also wanted to make a living off of it. So the dream that everybody had was to get a paid job working on open source software. And some of us did. We got jobs at like HP, Red Hat, IBM, these companies that were realizing the value of open source. And some people went on to create companies around open source. It's like Nat Friedman, the former CEO of GitHub, and Miguel de Icaza created Helix code around GNOME, and they produced it and supported it. And others went on to create companies that developed software under contract. And that's worked. Oh, and some of us created nonprofits that collected donations from companies that worked on open source software. And then we used that money to provide infrastructure to the projects. That has worked really well for 20 years. But now it's time to figure out, well, it's worked really well for 20 years. I'm curious how many of you have some kind of paid job that lets you do some kind of open source or have some kind of income? Awesome. Because if you look at where we are today, 90% of companies use open source software whether they know it or not. And when someone goes to develop a new piece of software, if they're wise, if they're doing it in a way that builds on the work of others, 80% of that new software is going to be free and open source software. So they're going to add 20% to the top of it. And so all the Fortune 500 companies are using it. All software, not just software companies. We saw Mercedes-Benz in the keynotes. It's car companies, it's retailers. And we need to make sure some of that value goes back to the people that are creating and developing the software. And companies really want to do that. Companies really want to make sure that the software that they depend on is secure and sustainable. But they just need a way to do it. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the ways that we can help those companies give you all money and how we can all support each other in this effort. Because we're going to need a lot of developers. We're going to need 200,000 new developers a year. So that by the year 2030, that's 1.6 million new developers that we don't have today. That's twice the population of San Francisco. So just think of all the people that you saw on the street on your way here. We need twice that many developers in the world. New developers. So not only do we need a new model, we need a lot of it, which is going to require models to create the sustainability. And it's a really good time. I'm sure you've seen the news, like governments, companies, they're really worried about making sure that the software they're using is secure and sustainable, and so they're willing to invest in that right now. So now's the time to propose a model. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that GitHub has done and is going to do, and you saw a couple of them announced at the keynote this morning. But I also really welcome you to start a conversation about this. If you have an idea, if you have a way that you would like to make money, a way that we can make the world a better place around open source software and with open source software, like, have a conversation here. This is the group of people that can change the world, that can help make that happen. So I wanted to talk about the problem just for a second, the way I see it. So imagine I'm a developer. I am a developer. And I had a problem. You know, I have to do the same stupid routine for 30 minutes every day when I'm writing my code. And I'm like, I could do better. So I take a couple of weekends, maybe a couple months, and I write a little program. I put in a library that solves my problem. And it's not anything I'm going to start a company around. You know, it's not anything I was planning to make money off of. So I put it out on GitHub as open source software under the open source software license. And all of you are like, wow, that would save me 30 minutes a day. And so you download it and you use it. And that's great. Like, I'm super excited that you're doing that. And then all the big companies in the world, they're like, we have that problem too. And they download it and they include it in their software and in their products that they ship to their customers. And pretty soon the whole world is using it. And everyone would be willing to help me, but it's a pretty small thing. It doesn't need a lot of people working on it. It just works. And so you're all just using it. And nobody's paying me for it because it's done, and nobody's helping because it's done. And then one day, I'm on my way to drop my kids off at school before work, or maybe I'm actually on vacation in Hawaii, and my phone starts blowing up. And somebody reported a security vulnerability, inappropriately probably, very publicly because they didn't know about our new GitHub feature that lets you report it privately. And everyone wants me to fix it. And because I'm a good person, and because I care about my software, and I care about all these people, and I care about all their customers, I take a couple of days of my vacation or a couple of days off work, and I fix it. And nobody compensates me for that because there's no model for it, right? Like, which company would give me money, and how would they do that? So that's the problem that we have. And if I got compensated for it, I might still miss a couple days of my vacation, but it would really go a long ways to explaining to my family why I did that. So that's what I'd like to see. Some of that value flow from users and companies back to the developers and creators of the project. So that's the problem as I see it. There's also a problem in how we think about the problem. A lot of times, we refer to companies as people. And US law also refers to companies as people often. But the problem is companies aren't people. So let me give you a little example. Say I have a couple of apple trees. I do have a couple of apple trees. And if you know apple trees, they produce a lot of apples. So I take a couple of bags of apples to my neighbor, because I'm just trying to get rid of these things. And my neighbor says, wow, she gave me a lot of apples. So she makes an apple pie, and she brings me an apple pie. And I'm like, somewhere, probably not consciously, but somewhere in my head, I'm like, wow, she went through a lot of effort to make me an apple pie, and all I did was give her a bunch of apples that were going to rot. So next time it snows that winter or that fall, I go over and shovel her walk. And she goes, wow, we had like 10 inches of snow, and Stormy shoveled my walk. So when I come here to San Francisco, she goes, would you like me to walk your dogs while you're out of town? And that give and take, that back and forward, we call it friendship, but it's how society works. It's a very subconscious way of making sure you give back to society what society gives to you. And there's not a single consciousness at a company to do that. It's not that there are people at the company that want to do that, but the company as a whole can't do that. So we need to create processes that help those people at the company that are watching that give and take, help them figure out how to tell their shareholders and their management ways to give back. And in order to do that, we need to figure out what's the funding, infrastructure, and growth. So where's the value and the money going to come from? What's the infrastructure that's going to make it flow to those developers? And then how are we going to grow it? Because it's going to have to scale to not only all the developers we have now, but that 1.6 million that I talked about by the year 2030. So let's start out talking about the funding. So I put this number up here. So GitHub contributed, in addition to hosting projects, in addition to providing like $120 million of action minutes that you heard at the keynote every year, GitHub also gave $1 million in funding to open source software projects this year. And I tell you about it not to brag. I tell you about it to show that this is the example that we're trying to set in the world. And so as an example, back in June was Maintainer Month. How many people celebrated Maintainers Month? Yay, maintainers. Yeah. So what we did is we thought, what could we give the maintainers, the projects that we depend on? So we ran a report, and it turns out, using Dependabot, and we used 900 and something projects that GitHub software depends on. So we had a budget of $500,000, and we gave the $500,000 to the 900 projects that were signed up for GitHub sponsors, because we needed an infrastructure to give them the money. It turns out each person got about $533, I think. We debated, like, should we round it down to 500? Did that sound better? We decided to give them our entire budget. So we gave $533 to each of those 900 projects. And like I said, I say not to, we owed those projects that money. Like, they had provided that value to us. But what was really fun is that other companies came to us and said, how did you do that? How did you decide how much money to give? How did you get the money to 900 different projects? Like, what are you going to do moving forward? So we're setting an example for the world that I hope the world follows. So I don't know if I'm sure if you saw the keynote this morning, it was awesome. If you haven't seen the keynote, I recommend you go see it. There's a lot of really awesome demos. Hello, I've never had a bird in my talk before. The dog in the previous talk was cuter, but I'll take the bird. So one of the programs that we launched was GitHub Accelerator. And the idea is to give maintainers and developers time to see if they can make a living off of their project, independent of a salary. Or maybe they're looking for a job working on their project. So the idea is to give a maintainer 10 weeks of time where we give them $2,000 a week, enough to cover hopefully their living costs, their family expenses, give them just a little bit of freedom. And then we'll provide them mentorship and marketing and classes and a cohort, because it's always fun to be in a struggle with people that are going through the same thing as you are. So we'll provide all of that. And then the hope is that at the end of 10 weeks, success would look like they got a job working on their project. Or success would be they found venture capital money. So success would be some kind of funding model for them where they get to work on their open source software project. And we get to, in part, thank Brian Douglas. Brian Douglas, B. Dougie, for those of you that might know him, was a GitHub employee. And he had an open source software project called Open Sauced. And he came to us earlier this year, and he said, can I have a couple months off? He said, I want to explore something. I want to see if I can make a go at Open Sauced. Would you just give me a couple months to go try? We said, sure. And he went off, and not only did he successfully add a bunch of features to his project, but he also got a bunch of venture capital money and is now making a go of Open Sauced. So unfortunately for us, he didn't come back to GitHub. But fortunately for us, he set an example for the world of a new model that we can implement and help implement. The other project that we're working on as ways to explore how we can get more funding from the people benefiting for the software back to the developers is the GitHub Fund. So we just announced that we're going to take $10 million, and we are going to be like a venture capital company. I don't know a lot about venture capital myself, but we're going to be like a venture capital company for companies that want to build solutions with and around open source software. So you can actually apply for both of these funds right now. You can go online if you are a developer with a project. For the accelerator, we're looking for projects that have some adoption, somebody who's already had an idea and started it and wants some time to prove it. So you can go apply for that one, and you can apply for funding from the GitHub Fund. And like I said, this should be a joint conversation among all of us. So if you have an idea, we would love to hear it. So I mentioned B. Dougie as one example. The other example is Lias, and Lias's name was on the slide in the keynote. Lias is from Kerala, India, and he started coding when he was 8 years old. He also had a problem that he wanted to solve. He wrote an open source API development ecosystem, a long word for a very useful tool called Hopscotch. And he has so he got a grant from GitHub India to go explore what he could do with his project. And he has a million users now, and he's got more funding and innovation and progress and possibilities. So we really want to see more Eliases in the world, more people taking that time to explore what they could do. And in order for that to happen, in order for there to be more B-Duggies or be more Eliases, we have to have that infrastructure that I talked about. Some way to get the funding to identify the projects. Like a lot of companies, if 90% of companies are using open source software, whether they know it or not, a lot of them have no idea what they're using. And to them, that's initially a problem from a security perspective, because they don't know when there's a security vulnerability if they're using that project or not. But it's also a problem if they want to contribute to the ecosystem. So we need a way to fund that back. We have GitHub sponsors now that I'll talk about in a minute, but there needs to be more ways.
And so we're seeing a lot of momentum.
I just wanted to,
and I think that
you probably all heard about OpenSSL. It's very visible
is
because a
another
lot
great
of projects
example of
depended
the
on
core
it, and it had an
technologies
issue.
continuing to mature.
But I just wanted to point out that
there are
the
gigantic security benefits for
magnitude of a
developers,
few open
not
source
just for
software
security
developers,
teams.
the impact that they can have on the world. So
We've seen a lot
OpenSSL
about
has
security
18
today, but
maintainers.
there is a lot more
They
coming
have
for security.
1.3
There is one of my
billion
favorite named
so
sessions,
1.3
how
billion
GitHub uses
people on
GitHub
this
to secure
planet
GitHub, which
depend
sounds
on a piece
amazing.
of
But
software
remember,
written
we
by
have it
18 people. 66% of the web is using OpenSSL. So imagine if they had gotten more funding, like what those 18 people could have dreamt up if they could have worked on it full time. Or maybe they could have doubled their numbers or tripled their numbers. That's the innovation that we want to see in the world by making this funding flow. So in order to do that, we have to take it from the developers that create the software, a company that decides to use it, they ship a product to users, those users pay them for the software support, and then that money needs to flow back to the developers. So one way that we've done that is investing in our supply chain. I told you how we invested $500,000. We did it with GitHub sponsors. So GitHub sponsors is a way that anyone here who uses a piece of open source software can give a little bit of money to the person that wrote that software. Kind of, you could buy them a coffee if you wanted to. But you could also say, wow, my company is making $1 million a month, and I depend on this piece of software. I'd like to give you $5,000 because I think the benefit I'm getting out of it is $5,000 a month. So it's a way for both companies and individuals to give back. And companies really want to give back. I said that earlier. But I want to just stress that they do want to give back. Sometimes they want to give back for the publicity. They want to be recognized for what they did, the support that they offered. But often they want to make sure that that software is successful. Like they depend on it. Their business depends on it. They want to make sure that you keep working on it and that you're successful. So if you tell them they can give $1,000 and 9 other companies will give $1,000 and then you'll work on it full time, that's a great story to them. Companies also want to, I think. So there is quite a few reasons. We've done some studies, but these companies want to support the open source software ecosystem. And so far, in the last couple years, we've had $25 million flow through GitHub sponsors back to maintainers. I think we can keep growing that because we just launched in India and Brazil recently. We're in 68 countries. I think we just added 30-something. And the pickup has been amazing. In Brazil, when we launched, tons of people signed up. But it wasn't just an appetite to receive money. All the people signing up for GitHub sponsors are I'm willing to take money. There was a huge appetite to give money to the projects that they depended on. So one of the developers in Brazil got 10 new sponsors in the very first week that we launched. So that was 10 people or 10 companies that said, your stuff is so valuable that we want to make sure that you can support it, that you can do this full time. So now I want to talk to you about several ways several programs that we have to grow the community. Because like I said, we need these 1.6 million people. So how are we going to do that? And I have to admit that my slides are too small to see. So GitHub CoPilot, if you saw it in the keynote, GitHub CoPilot and Hey GitHub are just amazing. So GitHub CoPilot was trained on natural language encode. And it's basically taking the grunt work out of coding. So you can type in what you want it to do, or if you're using Hey GitHub, you could actually just tell it that you want a program, an array of this size or these things, and that you want it to search, and it does it for you. If you haven't seen a demo, I highly recommend that you do. We have actually studied people using CoPilot and not using CoPilot, and people that are using CoPilot are much happier. They get to stay in the flow, so when they have a question, instead of having to go out to the internet and search for the answer and then copy and paste and bring it back to the development environment and then replace all the function names and all the variable names, they just type an idea and CoPilot does all that work for them. And then they get to stay in their flow and focus their time on the problem that they're trying to solve. The next program that we've tried out and that we're going to double down on is Allin. So Allin for students, we focused primarily on universities that had primarily black students. And we took 30 students in our pilot, and 90-something% of them had not even heard of open source software. 90% of them had not had an internship. I discovered recently that knowing about internships is a diversity and inclusion issue. I got really lucky. My parents didn't know about technology internships when I was in college. But I had a professor who, when I came to him, said, "Why aren't you applying for internships?" And I was like, "What are those?" So even knowing about internships is an inclusivity thing. So these students, these 30 students, didn't know about open source, didn't know about internships. We put them through this summer program, and 100% of them, all 30 of them, ended up with jobs in the tech industry, working on programming software. It's a big round of applause for these students. A lot of hard work went into it, and they were really successful. So I said we were going to double down. We're actually going to, how do you say 10 down? Like we're going to do it times 10. 10x, yes. This year we're going to target 300 students in the program. We're also working on things like externships where students can get jobs at companies. So we have lots of ideas, and we'd love to see others and other companies also adopt ideas like this and help new students learn, especially students that might not have heard about open source software or about computer science even. If we're going to get to 1.6 million, we need a lot of people. We need everybody involved. We're also looking at a program that we're going to call Allin for maintainers. We're seeing if we help the students like this, our existing maintainers, what do they need to be successful in addition to money? Like what kind of mentorship and what kind of programs can we offer to them? So that's what I wanted to propose to you today. Not so much like all the ideas that we have, although please participate. We want them to be successful. But we also want to hear all the ideas that you have. All the things that you think would help us grow the open source ecosystem and help make the funding flow from the people that are benefiting from it, the people that are making money or seeing value in it. How do we capture that value? How do we make it flow back to the people that created the software so that they can continue to support it and continue to develop new things? So I told you at the end of this, I have a request for you. So if you don't want to talk to anybody, you don't have to raise your hand again. But if you're new to open source and are here to learn more, raise your hand again. You'll have to remember the people that raised their hand. Thank you for those that were brave. So for those of you that didn't raise your hand, I'd love you to go up to one of those new people and ask them what they need to be successful in open source. What are they looking for? And have a conversation. Generate some ideas. I'd love to be part of them too. Thank you very much.